I mean, I guess the question would be, how studied and researched is it?
Years of study. In some ways, you could say thousands of years of study. This is where I get myself into a lot of trouble with archaeologists.
Historians have an oath to the truth, an oath that they have broken. And because of this, in the vacuum of answers that they have left behind, snake charmers and charlatans have sold fictional tales that the many had to accept. But when we look at the evidence, when we actually look at the evidence, then there is no need for fairy tales. That missing link that historians will not tell us is not a mystery at all. Let me tell you how it all began. Imagine you are the citizen of a great civilization in 9500 BC. The kingdom you live in is so big that it stretches from the most western point in northern Africa all the way to Ethiopia, on the far east of Africa. Your land is green and lush, and your crops help to feed the largest army the world has ever known. Your king is so powerful that he is named after the Atlas Mountain, and your capital city is so beautiful and so advanced that visitors call it Atlantis, beautiful land of the King Atlas. Suddenly, one night, a wave of seawater taller than a skyscraper ravages through the land. You barely escape with your life along with a few survivors. When the water retreats, there is nothing left, no trace of your once great empire. Everything has been pulverized by a gargantuan flood of seawater and mud. All your art, buildings, and historical records are now gone forever. This engraving is chiseled into the heart of the awakened ones, those who are said to be without history, birthed civilization itself. Because of all the salt and debris from the flood, the land is now barren, and very few things will grow. After a few years, you notice that the rain cycles have changed. Where life was easy and the ground generous, you now find it hard to make it from season to season. Even all the great animals are gone. One afternoon, you hear of a great commotion outside of the cave you have been hiding in. You come out and you find a long caravan marching in the distance. Happy to find signs of civilization, you rush down to them. As you get close, you notice that their clothes look like that of your people, but they are slightly different, and they speak the same language as you, but with a weird accent. And with them, you recognize people from different cities that were bordering your once great city. You ask them where they are going, and they point in one direction, east, towards the great river. They say that it is the last place that hasn't been destroyed by the waves, and that it is the only place where food still grows, but it is far. You rush to grab your things and join the caravan. A few days later, taking shade from the scorching sun, you muster enough courage to ask them what is that great river they speak of. They finally answer, the Nile. Like many, you haven't heard of this civilization before, not because it didn't exist, not because we don't have evidence of how large and how powerful it was. It is only spoken about sometimes as Atlantis, and other times as a mythical place to make sure that any serious studies about it are dismissed. No, you haven't heard about this civilization because historians will not speak openly about them, and historians will not mention them because of their identity. Because once you realize who they were, it will change your perspective on history once and for all. As archaeologists unearth evidence across the globe, it becomes increasingly clear that the ancient civilization originating from black Africans not only initiated civilization around 10,000 BC, but also extended it across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. The examination of megalithic structures worldwide reveals striking resemblances, contributing to the evidence of a highly sophisticated ancient society. This evidence suggests the existence of a civilization advanced enough to map the Earth with remarkable accuracy, master stone construction, and make significant astronomical discoveries, including the planets in our solar system, their movements, and even calculate the precession movement of the stars. This civilization's legacy is evident through countless clues left behind, illustrating their profound impact on the world. Their influence was widespread and long-lasting, so much so that the Greeks and the Egyptians described them as Atlantean, and they came to be venerated as gods everywhere they brought their technology and way of life. But beyond the myth and the labels, these were the people to whom we owe the restart of civilization after the great catastrophe of the Younger Dryas. And today, whether we admit it or not, the evidence on their identity is definitive. They left clues in the form of monuments, writing, statues, drawings, linguistic origin, ancient maps, and above all, genetics, all pointing to the same people, Black Africans. All of these pieces of evidence we will cover in this video, and by doing so, rediscover our grandiose ancient history and see how it influenced the whole globe. Before we get into the evidence of who these ancients were, let's first get a sense of how sophisticated their civilization was. If you have ever heard of the Piri Reis map and the Orontes Phineas maps, then you know that they both depict a coastline of South America before the full discovery of the continent by the Europeans. What's more intriguing is that they both depict the continent of Antarctica before the ice had been covered. And guess when was the last time the continent was ice-free? 6,000 years ago. So right in the middle of the Holocene, about 6,000 years ago, there was a sudden increase in global temperature that was also observed in a very sudden retreat of the southern ice cap. And you can see that in this 2021 paper by Dominic Winsky from the University of Maine. More research is emerging on that period of rapid ice sheet retreat. But for me, it isn't the presence of Antarctica that is the most surprising, but it is the fact that these maps show an excellent system of latitude and longitude. These medieval maps are all said to reference the Ptolemaic maps. If you take a look at this map, you can see it, and it is in fact a better proportional representation of the Earth. Notice how the longitudinal lines diverge. Well, this is how it is supposed to be because the Earth is round. So that means whoever made this map knew that the Earth was round, but also devised an accurate system of pinpointing the location of anything on the globe. A system, I might add, that we still use today. When you look at our maps today, our latitude and longitude system is biased because it heavily distorts the countries in the northern hemisphere to the disfavor of the countries at the equator. This is why the distance from Moscow to Beijing looks about twice the size of the distance from Mauritania to Ethiopia. And yet, in reality, they are exactly the same. So did the Greek invent this mapping system? Clearly not. They took it from the Africans when they settled in Egypt. So someone had the technology to navigate the globe during the Holocene, mapped it out with precision, and left us records of it. And to know who they were, we need to go back to the beginning of civilization. Because of the large amount of evidence we have to present, we will break down the video in 3 major parts. First, we'll deal with the scientific search and evidence showing the ethnicity of the originator as Black Africans. Starting in 10,000 BC with the Natufians and the inventors of agriculture and the builders of Göbekli Tepe and the great lost civilization of the ancient Sahara. To the Nubia-Kemetic civilization that we call today ancient Egypt, to the Sumerians, culture holders who spread these know-hows. Then, we will share the evidence that shows that these originators spread their knowledge all over the globe in multiple colonies and civilizations that we call classical civilizations. Here again, the hands of the Africans are clearly shown with all too similar techniques and cultural icons present in all sorts of civilizations in the Bronze Age, including the early Greek, the Etruscans, the originators of the Roman civilization, the Chinese civilization, and the Olmecs, the Mother High culture in Mesoamerica. Lastly, we will see how long this civilization lasted, and how their descendants after the Bronze Age spawned yet more civilizations throughout ancient times. From the Olmecs, the Chinese, the civilizations in the Pacific, the Garamantes, to the Carthaginians, to Benin, the Ghana Empire. Major thanks to Camgiverse for his invaluable research contribution. His channel is a must for all Afro descendants. As in all of our videos, we cite our sources and provide additional source material in the video description. It all started with the oldest builders, a people who for the longest time we thought were primitive, and we are now discovering that they were anything but. Now, whether or not there was a great civilization before or during the Ice Age that got wiped out at the end of the Younger Dryas, that I will leave for another video. But what we do know is that in 10,000 BC, humans faced a critical time in their history. Already conditions during the last Ice Age were extremely precarious for humans. Cold weather affected all of Europe and much of the African continent. The Younger Dryas itself caused another sudden fall of temperatures around 13,000 BC, with an even more rapid rise in temperatures 11,500 years ago. This sudden rise in temperature is associated with two major events: the rapid and brutal rise in sea levels, a rise so consequential that it changed the coastline of our planet for good. So any human settlements that would have taken refuge next to the coastlines to get a little bit of warmth would have been wiped out. The second major event that occurred was the sudden loss of most large land animals at the time. This period is also associated with sudden cataclysmic levels of inundations and floods. But as devastating as these floods were, they brought in one element that would benefit the humans that survived. A significant amount of silt from the melting of the ice from the last Ice Age and the Younger Dryas, along with the rapid flash flood and current changes, created a very fertile soil in the region of the Near East, the Fertile Crescent. And it is this soil, along with a now very favorable climate for humans, coupled with a lack of large predators in abundance, that set the conditions for humans to discover agriculture. And as soon as humans started to domesticate plants and animals, there was no stopping them. The population size of humans exploded overnight, but their sophistication increased too. A myriad of tools, never seen before in the archaeological record, suddenly appear with the invention of agriculture. Sickle and flint blades, stone mortar and pestles, containers to ferment grain for beer. And this is what researchers from the University of Michigan confirmed in the 2005 paper, where they showed that Natufians had clear sub-Saharan African linkage. And I quote, "It is a further surprise that the Epipaleolithic Natufian of Israel, from whom the Neolithic realm was assumed to arise, has a clear link to sub-Saharan Africa." End quote. They also go on to reveal one of the most telling facts about the Natufian language, and it is that in their linguistic proximity analysis, Natufian more closely resembles the Niger-Congo language family. And this is in line with multiple other data points that clearly show that the Natufians were an advanced Black African culture. There are plenty of scholarly articles that validate this fact. I won't cite them all. But here is one interesting publication from the New York Times nonetheless, where the Natufians are described as a Negroid people by Sir Arthur, with wide faces, flat noses, and long, large heads. Skeletal remains of those practicing the Natufian culture date from the transition from the Neolithic to the Paleolithic. The Natufians were of medium stature. Their skulls were also dolichocephalic, with broad, short faces and a tendency towards prognathism. This was clarified in the book Paleopathology and the Origins of Agriculture by Mark Nathan Cohen and George G. Amalagus. Both dolichocephaly and prognathism are key traits of African populations. Dr. Iosef Lizaridis and Dr. Nathan Rowland from Harvard performed extensive genetic tests on Natufian archaeological remains, and this is what they found. Natufians had clear African DNA markers without any Neanderthal admixture. And where before the Natufians had been denied the building of Göbekli Tepe because it was thought as too advanced, Dr. Gil Hackley and Dr. Avi Gopher in their 2015 paper have clearly shown that Natufians were building temples with superb architectural planning and that they were the only people with enough specialization to do so. But he is not alone. Researcher Dr. Dorothy Garrett attests that the Natufians who were living in the Middle East since 13,000 BC would have been behind the construction of Göbekli Tepe, soon after the Holocene period began. So our Natufians, who speak a Niger-Congo language and have Black African phenotype and genes, created the first known megalithic superstructure in history, one that has themes and relics that appear in multiple other subsequent civilizations. And if Göbekli Tepe is any indication, the Natufians were very sophisticated. In Göbekli Tepe, they show that they had knowledge of so many sciences: mathematics, architecture, astronomy, just to name a few. In fact, all this information adds up because we already know that Africans were performing advanced mathematics 25,000 years ago with the Ashango bone. The bone shows mastery of prime numbers, multiplications, division, and even relationships between prime numbers. relationships that we just rediscovered and understood recently. And guess where the Ashango bone was found? You guessed it, in the Niger-Congo area, which matches the language spoken by the Natufians. They were also performing burial practices similar to the ones found in ancient Egypt. They were so sophisticated that they performed a very early version of mummification for their dogs that they buried with them in their tombs. If anything, research is now showing that the Natufians, that we originally considered as primitive early agriculturalists, were in fact a very sophisticated civilization that would spread architecture, culture, and science to its next-door neighbor as its people migrated to Egypt, Sumer, and as we will see in the next section, to the still green and lush Sahara. Armed now with agriculture, mathematics, and a stone-building culture, the Natufians influenced the whole globe, starting with Egypt. And we see the continuity of the Neolithic culture in very early Egyptian history. In 8000 BC, the inhabitants of ancient Egypt, Kemet, built one of the most astonishing celestial observatories called Nabta Playa. This monument shares many characteristics with Göbekli Tepe. They are both made of stones and both are aligned to the stars. But Nabta Playa alone shows that the Africans already had a very high level of sophistication, specialization, and enterprise well before the Sumerian civilization even started. Then a few millennia later, they would go on to invent writing, arguably one of the most consequential inventions in human history. And in his research, Dr. Günther Dreyer of the German Archaeological Institute clearly demonstrates that the Africans from Kemet were the first to use writing before the Sumerians inherited the concept. But they would also create some of the most enduring monuments in ancient times, all of them built out of stone. And aside from the pyramids and the Sphinx, one of the most enigmatic and complex structures ever built is the Osirian, which is found below the temple of Seti I. This temple has dimensions and properties that are simply, well, there is no other term to describe it. Its dimensions and properties are Atlantean. This is an underground complex with a 15-meter moat and a hollow center island. Truly deserves to be opened to be studied more. Take a look at this 3D reconstruction of its architecture. Notice also how massive each of the stone pillars are. There are countless genetic and archaeological studies that have shown that the people from the Nubio-Kemetic civilization complex were black African. We will just name a few. In her research paper, Dr. Katrin Bard attests to the origin of complex society in Kemet from the south. In fact, Dr. David Okenor goes further and complements that argument with his own research on prehistoric Kemet between 5000 and 3000 BC, was not very different in its nature from that of contemporary African cultures. It is also ironic that one of Dr. Okenor's students was none other than Zahi Hawass. History, it seems, likes comedy. Add to this the studies that show that pre-dynastic Egyptians had L0F genetic markers showing they originated from Central Africa. And the numerous genetic studies show that the most predominant haplogroup in ancient Egypt is the E1B1A, also called M2, which is most prevalent in black Africans from West and Central Africa. This is in line with the multitude of ancient Egyptians' artifacts and contemporary pharaoh statues showing them as unmistakably black African. And they would continue the megalithic culture that they had initiated in the Levant 4,000 years before, and would perfect it to such a scale that it took until the end of the 19th century for a man-made structure to rival it in height. The ancient Egyptians' myth that the Greeks relate to us as the story of Atlantis tells us that there was a grandiose civilization that got wiped out 12,000 years ago, and that they migrated to ancient Egypt to restart their civilization. The interesting thing is that as much as this story is considered a myth, there are too many elements that coincide with verifiable archaeological research. The date coincides with the meltwater pulse 1b, when we had sudden major warming that caused water-related damage throughout the world. Researchers are now showing that this flood event was so violent that it would have hit civilization with such force that little to no trace would have survived. The genetics also match. There is black African genetic continuity between people of the ancient Sahara and that of Kemetu. Cam Jeevers has shown this in multiple research reviews. Here is one of the hundreds of studies that shows that Central Africans migrated 9,000 years ago to the ancient Sahara and then migrated to Egypt. The location matches. The description matches, including how the port of Atlantis opened up to the southern seaport and the 3 rings of land. What's even more telling is that salt deposits can be found in the Rishat structure. Other similarities, such as the presence of black and red stones, both found near the eye. The presences of elephants, which has been confirmed to exist when the Sahara was green 12 to 6,000 years ago. In ancient Sahara there are depictions of tropical animals including elephants. We will do a separate episode on the possibility of Atlantis being in the Sahara. For now, even if the land described as Atlantis was not in North Africa, we have enough evidence to show that 1. Ancient Sahara was green, 2. Ancient Sahara was a large civilization with its own writing, agriculture, and sophisticated stone building, and 3. It was populated by black Africans, the same ones that migrated to ancient Egypt when the Sahara dried up. So before the Kemetu, that we call the ancient Egyptians before them, while the Sahara was still green, there was a large and grandiose civilization that existed throughout the Sahara. To get a sense of how big this African civilization was, we have to realize that the distance between Moscow in Europe and Beijing, China, are identical. 5,800 kilometers or 3,600 miles. Yes, this will not translate on the map because maps have been distorted to represent Africa as much smaller than it is, but it means that this civilization that existed there was one of the largest in human history, and they were very complex. Multiple splendid but little-known megalithic ruins have been found in the Sahara Desert. Researcher Babacar Sall states that, quote, "Ancient Sahara, the one before the desert, reaffirms its ethnic and cultural origins as black African." End quote. The people of ancient Sahara were already practicing mummification 1,000 years before the Egyptians. The mummy of the black African child called Uan Mahujaj confirms this. Their religious practices were also found in Kemet. In the ancient Sahara, we also find the oldest writing system ever recorded. Proto-Saharan script and Insabidi, both of them at least 1,000 years older than hieroglyphics. And in fact, some researchers are suggesting that these writing systems may have been the root for Medu Necher, also called hieroglyphics. But more research is needed to confirm this. For now, it suffices to know that ancient Sahara was one of the largest and most sophisticated civilizations ever. Research also shows that the people from the Natufian culture migrated to North and Northeast Africa, where they kick-started the ancient Sahara and subsequently ancient Egypt. Their descendants also started the Sumerian civilization. Renowned as the authors of the Epic of Gilgamesh, builders of ziggurats, accomplished mathematicians, astronomers, and credited with the invention of the wheel and our method of timekeeping, their influence reverberates through the ages. For centuries, it was widely assumed that the ancient Sumerians bore a resemblance to the modern inhabitants of their region. However, the evidence shows that the Mesopotamia civilization was in fact a continuation of the Natufian culture, both in terms of its ethnic identity and its cultural inheritance. Contrary to popular belief, particularly the early Sumerians who laid the very foundations of their civilization, from script and religion to technological innovations such as the wheel, were in fact of black African descent. This is perfectly illustrated in the victory stele of Naram Sin, where both Naram Sin himself and the people of Zagreb that he defeated are phenotypically black with full complement of afros, luscious lips, and long limbs. This knowledge has been within scholarly circles for 2 centuries, yet it has not been widely disseminated. Cranial analysis of remains found throughout early Mesopotamia all the way to 1000 BC are predominantly black. In 2009, researchers from the Department of Anthropology of the University of Florida made a startling discovery. The paper attests that the Semitic language, in fact, has its roots in all the African languages. And I quote, "These results indicate that the ancestor of all Semitic languages in our dataset was being spoken in the Near East no earlier than approximately 7,400 YBP, after having diverged from Afro-Asiatic in Africa." End quote. Here is a chart that depicts the evolution of Semitic languages, and notice their origin. So in short, well into the Bronze Age, Afro-Asiatic originated in Africa and fanned out towards the Levant, before further branching out into the various Semitic languages that we know. The true identity and origins of the Sumerians were elucidated by Albert Terrien de la Couperie, a distinguished linguist and China expert. He asserted that the Sumerians, Akkadians, and Assyrians, who referred to themselves as Salmat Kakadi, or black-headed people, were all of Black Kushite lineage. Despite this historical verity, depictions of Sumerians in popular culture predominantly portray them as Semitic or Caucasian, neglecting their African heritage. The misrepresentation of Sumerians as Europeans is perpetuated by showcasing artifacts from the Guqian rule of Lagash as indicative of the true progenitors of Sumerian civilization, despite no recognition of Guqian rulers in the Sumerian king list. In the words of the eminent 19th-century American anthropologist John D. Baldwin, it is now admitted that a people of the Kushite or Ethiopian race were the first civilizers and builders throughout Western Asia. These profound insights compel us to reevaluate our understanding of ancient civilizations and acknowledge the pivotal contributions of Black African populations to human history. So from the Niger-Congo basin, to the Natufians, to ancient Sahara, to the Nubio-Kemetic civilization complex, and Sumer, the Black African now had an inordinate amount of technology, knowledge, and resources, and they used these to spawn civilization everywhere they went, even in seldom expected places. Most people are familiar with the Greeks and the Romans, but what few know are the civilizations that preceded both of these civilizations, the Pelasgians and the Etruscans, and even fewer are aware of their ethnic makeup and who seeded them. The earliest known civilization in Greece was the Minoan civilization, which emerged on the island of Crete around 2700 BCE. The Mycenaean civilization followed, beginning around 1600 BCE and lasting until around 1100 BCE. The period of ancient Greece, commonly referred to as Classical Greece, lasted from the 5th century BCE to the 4th century CE, and is credited with giving us philosophy, democracy, literature, art and architecture, mathematics, sciences, and Olympic Games. This is the narrative that has been popularized. However, the Greeks themselves said that the origin of their civilization and knowledge was from the Africans in Kemet. Not only did the Greeks learn everything, and I mean everything they knew from the Africans in Kemet, but their civilization itself may have been started by the Africans. And the Greeks themselves attest to the fact that the Pelasgians started their civilization. They were the first people who later on, in 1600 BC, started the Mycenaean civilization. So the Pelasgians play a crucial role in the foundation of Greek civilization. Asius of Samos relates to us that, quote, Pelasgus was the godlike founder of the Pelasgians, and that from the Black Earth he came. End quote. Now where in antiquity have we heard the term Black Earth before? You guessed it. It is exactly the appellation of the ancient Egyptian land Kemet, which translates to both the Black Land and the Land of the Blacks, and that was just the start. Throughout the following millennia, the African colony in Greece continued to be the beneficiaries of all their sciences and also received a significant injection of African population. So much so that all the original Greek gods were black African gods from Kemet. The major tenets of their religion was African before it morphed into the later Hellenistic religion inherited by the Romans. Early Greek art is a copy-paste of the African civilizations, and innumerable and yet rarely publicized Minoans and coins depict black Africans. But this is also traceable through genetics. In her research 2001 paper, Dr. Arnaiz Vilena shows that even 4,000 years after the seeding of the Greek colony by the Africans, that the Greeks are found to have a substantial relatedness to sub-Saharan people, which separates them from other Mediterranean groups. The Greeks copied so many icons and elements from the African civilization that they even built a pyramid. Yes, many don't know, but Greece has a pyramid, smaller in proportion to that of the Africans in Kemet. This doesn't mean that the Greeks were black, but it shows that the African colonists in Greece came in such high numbers that their genes are still overrepresented 4,000 years after the African population had left. And even old Minoan frescoes depict phenotypically black people in large numbers, like this beautiful bas-reliefs from early Minoan periods that clearly show that Greeks knew how to paint people black when they wanted. Because here you can see both white and black females, taking away the often brought forth argument that the Greeks always painted females white and males black. Where the black Pelasgians kick-started the Greek civilization, the Etruscans also were the originators of the Roman civilization, and we will see who they were. Even paved roads, this quintessential Roman civilization staple, was first used by the Africans in Kemet, then passed on to the Greeks and the black Etruscans, who then gave everything they knew to the Roman. Now, before Rome became the colossal empire we all marvel at, there was a civilization so advanced, so ahead of its time, that it laid down the very foundations of what Rome would eventually build upon. We're talking religion, art, architecture, and more. The Etruscans had already perfected it. Ever wonder how those Roman roads and aqueducts, which are still admired today, came to be? The Etruscans were the masterminds behind those engineering feats, introducing the Romans to the genius of drainage systems and secret underground tunnels. Also, the Roman alphabet, that cornerstone of Western writing systems, is really an Etruscan alphabet. Despite their penchant for peace, the Etruscans were technological titans. Who exactly were these trend-setting Etruscans? Picture this. According to Gert Muller's eye-opening book, Black Origins of Ancient Rome, these were the black descendants of ancient Egypt. The Etruscans traced their roots back to the African civilizations of Kemet, or ancient Egypt, and brought their sophisticated culture, technology, and science to what would become Roman territory. They were described as dark-skinned Africans who even worshipped the Egyptian sun god Ra and built tombs that could easily be mistaken for something out of ancient Egypt. Eventually, the peaceful Etruscans would be displaced by the warrior Caucasoid tribe from the north, and they would go on to inherit everything the Etruscans had and label it Roman. This African civilization also expanded eastwards. But before we get to China and Japan, there are a few more civilizations that this gargantuan African civilization, the Natufio-Saharian Kemetic civilization, the NSK civilization, there are a few more that it seeded as colonies. We owe them our alphabet. They were said to be amongst the best navigators of the ancient world, but they are best known to be the parent culture of the Carthaginians. The Phoenicians were clearly another colony of the ancient African civilization. Before the invasion of the Persians in 539 BC, Phoenicia was predominantly black. In the centuries that preceded that invasion, the black people from Kemet settled in the Levant area and brought with them all the elements of their civilization, from writing to religion. These newcomers would have mixed with the black Natufian stock and the black Sumerian stock. Remember, the victory stele of Naram Sin depicts the king and the people he conquered as black Africans. And this can be seen in all the Phoenicians' outposts, like this one in Gades, Spain, where the heads of the Phoenicians' colonists have been found depicted in these beautiful carvings that are unmistakably African. But we can also see it in the Phoenician alphabet, which is a carbon copy of Hieratic, the more popular version of hieroglyphics, the ancient Egyptian writing system. Surely if we ask Jared Taylor, he would say that these early Phoenicians depicted here are servants. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. We also see it in their religion. Even early Phoenician deities like Baal are depicted as black ancient Egyptians with pharaonic poses. So the black Phoenicians had already settled most of their Mediterranean colonies by the time the Persian invaded in 500 BC. And one of those colonies was the famous naval power that almost toppled Rome. We have seen how prehistoric North Africa was predominantly inhabited by people who would be considered black Africans today. So it should come as no surprise that excavations in ancient Carthage reveal that the elite, including a high priestess of Tani, were almost exclusively black. Professor Eugene Pitard remarked, quote, "The woman buried there had Negro features. She belonged to the African race." End quote. This is supported by Professor Stéphane Giselle, who noted, quote, "The so-called Semitic type has not yet been found in Carthage." End quote. Carthage, founded by Phoenicians near modern-day Tunis, had a population with significant African ancestry. French historian Gabriel Audicio, in his 1961 work, stated that Hannibal was a North African. The majority of the Punic populace seems to have had African, indeed Negroid ancestry, indicating a mix of ancient Nubian and Aboriginal North African heritage. And we have already seen how ancient North Africa was wholly black. So this isn't surprising. So then, Jared and his crew might ask, why is it that the Carthaginian illustration that we see online always depict white people, and not even Asiatics, let alone black Africans, as the research shows that they were? Well, it is important to take into context the following facts. The majority of those depictions were made centuries after Carthage had ended as a civilization. Furthermore, those who did these illustrations were themselves European. It is only natural that they would paint this most successful of generals to their image. Lastly, those depictions of Hannibal that clearly show him as phenotypically black African are seldom, if ever, shared in history documentaries and books. And yet, when you look at the coins of Hannibal minted in Italy, this is what you see. As the great ancient African NSK civilization spread eastwards, they started showing up as deities all over Asia. Now, if there had been only one instance of Buddha showing clearly African phenotypes, then it could have been attributed to chance. But to find representations of the black man as deity all over Asia, in so many instances, calling it a coincidence is willful ignorance of the truth, or a convenient disregard for facts that would shatter the narrative that, quote, black people did not contribute to history, end quote. They are literally everywhere. Black Buddhas in Nepal, black Buddhas in Myanmar, black Buddhas in India, black Buddhas in Bangladesh, black Buddhas in Thailand, black Buddhas in Vietnam, and on and on. Head shavings amongst Buddhist priests and Kemet monks, use of linen for religious activities to symbolize purity in both Kemet and with the ancient monks, hint at a common sourcing. But that latter part cannot be confirmed. What is undeniable is the plentiful representation of black Africans throughout southern Asia as chief deity, all the way to China and Japan, where the great African ancient civilization did more than just influence religion. They started the whole Eastern civilization. All the way on the other side of the globe, Professor Sun Weidong has shown that the Bronze Age revolution that started in China wasn't a local occurrence, but was technology brought in from Kemet. After examining multiple bronze artwork from the Xia dynasty, he realized that the metal composition was the same as the metal composition in ancient Egypt, and it did not match the composition of any other place or period. This is corroborated by multiple written accounts, contemporary descriptions, similarity in writing, religion, mummification, burial practices, pyramid building, 200 pyramids in central China alone, name of the Black Kings, bone findings, and genetic studies. These seedings in the Far East were done in multiple waves, with the latest wave occurring at the end of the medieval era, with the Edo people of Nigeria injecting into Japanese society culture, language, way of life, and even the samurai transition. We did a full episode on the African seeding of China and Japan. I'll leave a link below. One of the most telling signs of Natufio-Saharian Kemetic civilization seeding of Japanese civilization is the presence of a very short-lived Neolithic culture in Japan, where identical sarcophagus coverings can be found in Japan to those found in ancient Egypt. They are so similar that they are virtually interchangeable. This and the many other similarities just cannot occur by chance. By now you must be thinking that it looks like the Natufio-Saharian Kemetic civilization colonized the whole globe. And if they were so influential, did they travel across the Atlantic? If you haven't heard of the Olmec heads, then I strongly encourage you to look into the work of Dr. Matthew Sterling from the University of California, who later joined the Smithsonian Institute. Of the Olmec heads, he said, and I quote, "Despite its great size, the workmanship is delicate and sure, the proportions perfect. Unique in character among Aboriginal American sculptures, it is remarkable for its realistic treatment. The features are bold and amazingly Africoid," end quote. And the Olmecs are the mother culture of Mesoamerica, meaning that from the Olmecs, other civilizations begat their writing culture, technology, and religion. In fact, the Olmec heads feature so many African traits that they even carry typical African headdress and African braids, including facial hair that the Native Americans do not have. Professor Alexander von Wuthenau, an art historian, has brought to public attention numerous Africoid portraits in clay, gold, and copper from ancient and medieval Central and South America. Professor Alexander von Wuthenau, who authored The Unexpected Faces in Ancient America, 1500 BC to 1500 AD, states, and I quote, "The startling fact is that in all parts of Mexico, archaeological pieces representing Negro or Africoid people have been found, especially in archaic or pre-classic sites," end quote. Mesoamerican glyphs have been shown to have been inspired by the great ancient African civilization, the Natufio-Saharian Kemetic civilization. In fact, the 18th century French missionary Pierre Maillard discovered that the Micmac have an ancient system of writing that is virtually the same as hieroglyphics. See for yourself, and it doesn't stop them. The Mesoamericans built extensively using pyramids. These pyramids are so similar to the ones in Egypt that the base of the Pyramid of the Sun is exactly the same as that of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Even their burial practices and golden funerary masks look very similar to the ones in Egypt, and even use the same material, gold. Here again, the hand of the African is everywhere and is also corroborated by the numerous Africoid remains that have been found in Mesoamerica and that have been dated to periods well before the arrival of Columbus. Researcher Femi Krasniqi demonstrated in his documentary The Great Pyramid K 2019 that the ancient Egyptians brought over their unit of measure to the Americas. The presence of the Africans can be found all the way in Peru on the western coast of South America. When you look at the construction technique of monuments in Peru and the complex interlocking stone walls, you can clearly see the technique, and often the architecture is the same. But it's not just in Mesoamerica that we find these similarities. As you will see, we find them all over the globe. Two of the key signatures of the NSK civilization are the building techniques and the architecture. They show up repeatedly all over the globe. Do I believe the ancients sometimes build their monuments out of hand-chiseled stone? Yes, they sometimes did. And when they did so, the marks can easily be seen. Imperfection when the artist removes too much stone, or the angle is not perfect. In fact, I challenge you to create any stone structure that fits so perfectly together that you cannot fit a piece of paper in between two blocks. They clearly had a technique, a technology to work stone that enabled them to achieve extreme precision without spending centuries of labor just to build one wall. This technique left clues behind also, like the knobs that protrude out of the blocks, or often the composition of the rock itself that doesn't match natural rock. But we will see this in detail in a future episode. For now, let's look at the polygonal stone walls. These polygonal stone wall constructions in Kemet, Europe, China, Japan, Mesoamerica, Peru, and others all appear and then suddenly disappear. The technology and knowledge of this exact construction method was shared and then lost again. Funny enough, they show up in Great Zimbabwe later. Great Zimbabwe, where hieroglyphics were also found on the walls by early explorers, even down to the knobs showing up on the stones of these cultures. When you add up all these similarities, it points to the same conclusion, that those who try to portray this as coincidences are the ones that are showing exemplary intellectual dishonesty with the goal of denying the obvious. That black people spread megalithic technology all over the world, and that this technology and building technique enabled them to build monuments out of stone, or a material that closely resembles stone, with a level of effort that is comparable to building with mud bricks or cement. The similarities go beyond the material, the unusual cut shape of the stone, They also show up in strange knobs left behind that often protrude out of the stone, as if it was a gelatinous liquid that later solidified. These knobs also show up in Ethiopia. They also show up in Nubia. They even show up in North America, Canada. The construction styles are very similar to the ones in Nimrod Castle in Lebanon. Ancient stone knobs have been found in Egypt, China, Lebanon, and Greece, but they are also perfectly drilled holes found in the stone in these civilizations. All these add up to a single originator, the Natufio-Saharian Kemetic civilization. If you are still thinking that these are coincidences, then these alleged coincidences also show up on the ancient metal clamp mechanisms that are used to hold giant stone blocks together are the same all over the world. How did this technology spread to ancient Egypt, pre-Columbian Peru, and Cambodia thousands of years ago? The most logical explanation is that it was developed with the civilization that had its oldest recorded use and then spread it all over the globe. And when we say all over the globe, we mean ancient Egypt, Ethiopia, Bolivia, Tunisia, Japan, Iran, Cambodia, Peru, Sudan, just to name a few. The clamps from pre-Columbian South America that have been examined show them to be made of a very unusual alloy: 2.05% arsenic, 95.15% copper, 0.26% iron, 0.84% silicon, and 1.70% nickel. This composition is particularly interesting because there is no source nickel anywhere in Bolivia. At first, archaeologists believed that clamps were brought to these grooves to be placed, but recent scans have revealed that metal was poured into these indentations, which means the builders had portable smelters. The metals used could only be melted at very high temperatures the ancients, to our knowledge, were not capable of. The rare alloy of nickel-bronze-arsenic requires extremely high temperatures. Does the high temperature help explain their stone construction technique? We will cover that in another video. Interestingly, in his movie on Ancient Egypt K 2019, researcher Femi Krasinski shows that the pyramids were built using a cement-like paste, and he also confirms the ethnicity of the ancient Egyptians: Black African. So then, where did they go? Where did the black people who colonized the globe from 10,000 BC to 500 BC go? They went south of the Sahara, and their follow-up civilizations, although seldom advertised, are as astonishing as Kemet itself, and now being rediscovered at great pace. The signature of the NSK civilization shows up in all too familiar patterns all over Black Africa. In the Senegambia, on the west coast of Africa, we find strange stone circles laid out in an area spanning 12,000 square miles or 30,000 square kilometers, and these stone circles are even older than Stonehenge. They show up again in the Blaauwbaaskral stone ruins in South Africa. They show up in Adam's calendar in South Africa too. It is said to be the oldest celestial observatory in history. Some date it back to 75,000 years ago. This would make sense, as it would coincide with the oldest estimates of Ishango bone and the Blombos cave markings. The Blombos cave markings themselves date back to 73,000 years ago and show a sophisticated marking system. It is clearly writing of some sorts, but we do not have any reference to decode it. They show up in the Nok culture in Nigeria. Nok culture is said to have migrated from the central Sahara region to settle in the current Nigeria in 1500 BC. And as we saw from research shared by Kamjiversi, this is not surprising. Nuk culture proves that the Natufio-Saharian Kemetic civilization had achieved a very high level of sophistication. When you admire their sculpture, you get a sense of the complexity of their society. They again show up as the Garamantes, this North African civilization that specialized in subterranean architecture and splendid stone building. Again, they have been proven to be Black African. This isn't surprising, as they would have been the continuation of the population that resided in the Sahara since antiquity. Yet another little-known African civilization. They show up again as the Great Empire of Ghana, right after the migration of the Black African from Kemet. With its amazing stone constructions, love for gold and trade. They show up again in the Great Empire of Benin, who built a city so great that early European explorers describe it as follows. Ulfert Dapper, 1668. Wrote, quote, "The King's Court is square, and is as large as the town of Haarlem, and entirely surrounded by a special wall. like that which encircles the town. It is divided into many magnificent palaces, houses and apartments of the courtiers, and comprises of beautiful and long square galleries, about as large as the Exchange at Amsterdam, but one larger than another, resting on wooden pillars, from top to bottom covered with cast copper, on which are engraved the pictures of their war exploits and battles. End quote. Richard Lander, 1830. Quote, "The city presents an appearance of great wealth and industry. The houses are large and well built, with courtyards, and the streets are broad and clean. The people are very industrious, and many of them exceedingly rich. There are many smiths, carpenters, and weavers among them, and their work is of a superior kind." The Portuguese were the people who called the land Great City of Benin, because they were astonished with what they saw, that the Edo people achieved centuries before any major cities in the world. Truly we have here in Benin the description of a very advanced civilization, one that had its own writing, chose to build using bricks made of locally sourced material instead of using stone, and as we saw before, it was a people who could navigate the globe, and when they did, they went all the way to Japan, where their warrior culture kick-started the samurai tradition. And the origin myth of the Edo people matches the archaeological data that we have seen, the genetic data that we have seen. Their religion is a direct inheritance of NSK religion. In sum, the Edo people of Benin are one of the groups that migrated directly from Kemet. And just like in Ghana, Ashanti, Mali, Songhai, Congo, Great Zimbabwe, and many more, they rebuilt grandiose civilizations that astonished the unsuspecting European explorers of the Middle Ages. Sir Ralph Moore, British Consul General for the Bight of Benin and Biafra, stated, "The appearance of the city as we approached it was very imposing. The walls of the king's palace, the numerous buildings, and the tall palm trees presented a picture of civilization and magnificence which were little expected in the heart of Africa." End quote. And yet it was only one of many. From the superb pre-colonial architecture of the Ashanti, along with its multitude of similarities with Kemet from the Ankh to the Scepter, to the Mali Empire, to the now lost palaces in northern Côte d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso, to the beautiful stone structures in Niger. All over West Africa, the architecture of the descendants of the Natufio-Saharian Kemetic civilization kept rebuilding wherever they could, one civilization as beautiful as the next. Cameroon, Empire of Congo with its gargantuan medieval civilization and its superb metal works. Even southeast, where they also built stone pyramids in Sudan. More pyramids than in Egypt itself, and left us the Meroitic script that has yet to be deciphered. Truly more efforts need to be mustered to translate that script, as it will unlock yet another great chapter of Black African history. And in Ethiopia, in the kingdom of Demet, which grew strong along with Kemet and kept the tradition of building with stone. They even have obelisks still standing. Their method of calculation, which is a binary method of calculation, is exactly the same as the one used in ancient Egypt, and is only rivaled by the Yoruba's base 60 mathematics, which is being extensively studied by mathematicians today. They even show up in Great Zimbabwe, where here again they build with stone, but they even brought with them their writing. Early European explorers to Great Zimbabwe attest to the presence of Egyptian hieroglyphics on the wall of the palace. But these have been destroyed in the Great Purge of the European colonists in their early efforts to remove and destroy any signs of civilization in the heart of Africa. Mainly because this went against their interests. These interests meant that they had to maintain the idea that the black man was estranged from civilization in order to justify his mistreatment all over the globe. I almost forgot to mention. The Kingdom of Benin built a protective wall that was longer than the Wall of China and easily qualifies as the greatest engineering project in human history. Sadly, this wall, just like many African relics, was destroyed by the Europeans, along with many of the pre-colonial magnificent 5-story, 20 meters high palaces built by the kingdoms in northern Cameroon. It is in fact Orwellian to maintain that black people did not build the pyramids in ancient Egypt, while maintaining that black people had no civilization to speak of. It is Orwellian because not only did black people build the pyramids in Egypt, but Kemet may not have been the summit of civilization. that in fact ancient Egypt was but a small division of this colossal NSK civilization, the Natufio-Saharian Kemetic civilization. And NKS was black African, of the same stock as black people in the diaspora today, from Seattle to Haiti to Somalia, descendants of Ramses III of the E1b1am2 haplogroup. And beyond cultural affinities, how do we know that the ancient Egyptians, the Natufio-Saharian Kemetic civilization, went to all these areas in the heart of Africa? In March 2023, Dr. Nancy Bird from the University College of London showed in her genetic research that there was mass migration from ancient Egypt Kemet into Central and West Africa. This migration corresponds to the various oral histories given by the Africans themselves. The numbers on the arrow indicate the sequence of migration as you go back in time. As you can see, the arrival of the Arabs caused mass migration of the Africans from Kemet into Central and West Africa. Arrows 5 and 6 also show that there was a mass exodus of black Africans from the North African countries towards the south. No, it is not evidence that is lacking to show that Africans were the progenitors of civilization, but further to this, black Africans were the ones who carried that civilization to the four corners of the globe. The original lie of trying to keep the African out of history for economic purposes has now transformed into a worldwide cognitive dissonance. A cognitive dissonance where an artificial stratification of the human has caused everyone to ignore the gift of the African to their ancient history via the Natufio-Saharian Kemetic civilization. A civilization so large that it went from the most western point of Africa, when it was still green, all the way to the Levant, that we call today the Near East, a location that is arguably well within the historical geographical bounds of Africa. These deniers are now faced with the dilemma that those who they have taught themselves to hate the most happen to be those to whom they own all the tools of civilization, from math to agriculture and astronomy, even as far as their vocabulary. And that lie has taken such height that they went so far as to try and suppress, and in many cases erase, all evidence of the black man in history. And if their argument was true, then there wouldn't be even one. There would be absolutely no instance of black civilization anywhere in the world. And guess how many we cited today alone? 42. 42 civilizations that were or that were started by black Africans. It is the irony of ironies that the descendants of the Natufio-Saharian Kemetic civilization in the 8th century returned to Europe, this time as the Moors to save Europe from its downward spiral of the Dark Ages. But if history teaches us anything, it is that even the great catastrophe of the Younger Dryas became an opportunity for the African to help himself and humanity. Here, too, the tragedy of the drying up of the Sahara, though it has caused the collapse of the great African civilizations, from ancient Sahara to Carthage and the collapse of Kemet, a catastrophe that caused unprecedented population decline and generational setback, hidden in that tragedy lies the blessings of our future. It is this same Sahara that served as a barrier, a veritable wall, to safeguard the retreat of the black African from Kemet to the empires south of the Sahara. And now that we have regrouped, now that we are now on both sides of the Atlantic in great numbers, strategically placed, I might add, with a booming birth rate and an abundance of resources, now we will rebuild our place in the halls of humanity. Not for ourselves, but for our children and the children of all mankind. Because the solution to the hatred we face lies in our own freedom, and once we are truly free, those who are also prisoners of the hate they have been programmed to be addicted to will also be free. And that freedom is given by that saying that was written on the walls of the temples in Kemet by our ancestors, a saying that the Greek were so fond of. Know thyself. Yes, that freedom is given by the knowledge of history, true history. Surely by now you have subscribed and clicked the like button. If you haven't yet, then at least leave a comment. Along with the many who have supported the channel financially, your positive comments are what helps me continue. To my Patreon supporters, YouTube members, crypto donors, and anyone who has clicked the like button, you guys are the Knights of Enlightenment. You all deserve the title of Initiates, the High Priest of Aswan, Protectors of the Oba, Great Griots to the Mansa, Counselors of Shaka, Priest of the Ethiopian Churches, Cavalry of the Almoravid Kings, Sword of the King of the Congo Empire, Advisors to the King Ngoya, Third Ring of the King of Atlantis, Golden Stool of Asantwa. I salute you all. If you liked this content, drop us a comment. Above all, share it with everyone you think can benefit from it. We hear a lot about the negative voices, but it warms our hearts to hear your positive comments. Join us and see how those who are said to be without history birthed civilization itself.